Welcome to the front lines of a war they thought would end before the snow. A war that began beneath a blazing summer sun with songs of victory, promises of glory, and dreams of home by Christmas. They marched across the endless steppe boots, biting into dry earth banners held high, believing the horizon was theirs. But the horizon lied. When the winds shifted and the skies turned gray, when the first snowflakes fell upon helmets and rifles, they realized the enemy they feared was not just flesh and steel. It was the cold itself. The year was 1942. The place Stalingrad, a city of factories and fire shattered by months of relentless bombing. Streets turned to rubble, smoke hung heavy, and the Volga River glistened under a thin skin of ice. German soldiers huddled in broken houses, their breath fogging in the air, their coats too thin, their rations running dry. Soviet forces closed in from the north and south, an iron ring tightening each day. Engines refused to start, weapons jammed with frost, and each sunrise brought only deeper silence. The frost crept into bones, into hearts, into hope itself. They had been told the war would be swift, that the enemy would fall before the cold arrived. But the winter came early, merciless and vast, and it buried everything: ambition, pride, even the sound of marching boots. By December, the snow no longer melted, and neither did belief. Close your eyes. Feel it. The bite of the wind on your cheek. The weight of a rifle too cold to hold. The sound of nothing but your own breath. This is where promises end and truth begins. Before we begin, take a moment. Breathe. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are, and at what second did you feel the cold settle in your chest? Because somewhere beneath this frozen silence, their story is still waiting to be remembered. Summer had long surrendered its warmth. The steppe that once shimmered in gold now lay bruised beneath gray clouds. The wind no longer carried songs of marching boots, only the dry rattle of leaves, the low hum of engines pushing eastward. In the summer of 1942, they believed the horizon would lead them to victory. Every sunrise seemed to promise glory. Every sunset painted their confidence across the sky in crimson light. From Berlin came words wrapped in pride. Before the frost returns, the Volga will be ours. The soldiers believed them, because to question was to invite doubt, and doubt was colder than the wind. They crossed the Dnieper and Don rivers with drums of triumph, banners whipping behind columns of tanks. Villages burned in their wake, bridges fell, fields turned black under the weight of artillery. The road stretched forever, a trail of smoke, blood, and footprints fading into dust. Letters sent home spoke of progress, of courage, of an end in sight. Mothers folded those letters close to their hearts, never knowing the words were written on borrowed time. By September, the sky changed. The days grew shorter, the sun colder. Mornings came wrapped in mist, the earth hard beneath their boots. Trucks bogged down in mud that froze by nightfall. Horses trembled, breath steaming in the chill, and still they marched, driven by orders that spoke of destiny. Ahead, rising from the plain, loomed the city Stalingrad, a jagged silhouette against the fading light. Smoke curled above its factories. The Volga glimmered like a blade. They saw ruins and thought them weak. They saw rubble and thought it broken. They did not see the spirit buried in the stones. Within the city, life clung to shadows. The bombers had come in waves, turning streets into graves, apartments into dust churches, into hollow shells echoing with prayers no one heard. Civilians moved like ghosts through shattered alleys, clutching blankets, clutching one another. And still the factories roared, forging shells, bullets resolve. The Red Army held the line room by room, floor by floor. Each building became a fortress, each wall a final stand. The city bled but did not bow. When the first German divisions entered Stalingrad, they believed it would fall within days. They seized railway stations, stormed through warehouses, climbed stairwells lined with rubble and death. They planted flags on rooftops only to lose them by nightfall. The Soviets struck from the shadows, snipers hidden in chimneys, grenades tossed from cellars, knives drawn in smoke-thick halls. It was no longer war. It was survival. Streets changed hands 20 times in a week. No one slept. No one sang. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The autumn winds turned bitter. Smoke mixed with falling snow. Flames froze mid-flicker against walls slick with ice. Men scraped frost from rifles that would not fire, struck matches that would not light. Rations shrank. Fuel vanished. Every step forward demanded a toll in blood, in warmth, in faith. And still Berlin demanded victory. The Führer's voice thundered through radio static. The city must be taken at all costs. So they stayed. And the frost crept closer. Beyond the city's ruins, the Soviet armies gathered. Hidden in fog, waiting in silence, they traced the weakness in the German lines, the flanks held by weary Romanians. The gaps stretched thin by distance. Generals whispered plans by candlelight maps spread over crates in icy tents. Operation Uranus, a name spoken like a storm. North and South would strike jaws, closing fast. In Moscow, Stalin listened without a word. The frost outside his window was sharp, but not as sharp as the trap he would set. Mid-November. Snow fell heavy across the steppe. The dawn erupted in thunder. Soviet artillery screamed from the horizon, tearing into trenches, shredding the illusion of safety. Tanks rolled like beasts of iron through white fog, crushing resistance beneath their treads. The earth shook. Men shouted radios, blared orders, collapsed into panic. Within days, the jaws met. North and South joined hands in fire. The Sixth Army, once the spearhead of conquest, was now the prey. Encircled, isolated, caught in a ring of steel and snow. Inside the pocket, silence returned. The sky turned pale, distant. Planes promised from Berlin arrived with too little, too late. The airfields froze solid landing strips, cracked with ice. Supplies dropped from clouds vanished into Soviet lines or shattered on impact. Bread was rationed by grams. Horses vanished from the stables. Even candle wax was eaten in desperation. Frost-bitten fingers clung to rifles, though there was no ammunition left to load. Nights stretched endless. The cold whispered through every gap, through every coat, through every prayer. Men huddled together in basements, wrapped in rags, sharing breath. The wounded lay on stretchers that froze to the floor. Some spoke of home, some of God. Most spoke no more at all. The Volga, frozen solid, carried the echo of Soviet engines' reinforcements gliding across the ice. Above, flares painted the sky white, each burst revealing more bodies than soldiers still alive. Commanders sent desperate signals, fuel gone, ammunition nearly exhausted, casualties beyond count. The response came cold as the air. Hold your ground. Relief is coming. But outside, the rescue stalled, swallowed by snow and Soviet guns. Days passed. Weeks. The ring tightened. Hope thinned. By December, temperatures plunged below -30. Breath froze mid-air. Eyelids sealed with frost. Fires died within minutes, devoured by the wind. The city was silent now. No birds, no engines, only the groan of steel under ice. The men stared into the white horizon and saw nothing but their own reflection, pale, hollow, fading. Letters home were no longer written. There were no words left. only whispers scratched in diaries. We fight the cold now, not the enemy. They once believed the war would end before winter. But winter had ended everything they knew, the warmth, the will, the illusion that destiny could be commanded by man. And over Stalingrad, the snow kept falling. Quiet, endless, merciless, burying cities, soldiers, and dreams beneath a silence no victory would ever break. By December, the sky itself seemed frozen, a sheet of white pressed over the steppe, unbroken, endless, merciless. Somewhere beneath that silence, an army was dying, not in battle, not in glory, but slowly, quietly, in the space between breaths. They had once numbered 250,000 men of every trade and title, each carrying a rifle, a memory, a belief. They now existed as fragments scattered across the ruins of a city that no longer had a name, only a sound, the low groan of wind over metal and bone. The ring had closed weeks ago. The maps in Berlin still spoke of victory of an army temporarily encircled. But here inside the pocket, reality was smaller. A few 100 meters of ruin, a few ounces of bread, a few hours before frost returned. The first thing to vanish was movement. Trucks sat dead, half buried in snow. Tanks stood still, their barrels iced tracks welded to the earth. Horses froze mid-stride, grotesque statues of war ribs sharp as knives beneath their hides. Fuel turned to jelly. Lubricant congealed inside weapons. Men struck matches under bolts, breathing on gunmetal to make it live again, only for the frost to reclaim it minutes later. The sound of engines died, replaced by coughing by the wind, by the distant thump of Soviet artillery. When the shells landed, they threw up clouds of snow instead of dust, soft, silent explosions that muffled even the screams. Then came hunger. It crept faster than the enemy, colder than the air. The bread rations fell 100 grams, then 50, then 25. The loaves turned black, stretched with sawdust and ground peas. They boiled belts, shoes, candle wax, horse bones. The smell of burnt leather filled the bunkers. Men gnawed buttons from coats, chewed bark from firewood, scraped ice from walls to trick their stomachs. They no longer dreamed of food, only of warmth. One officer wrote, "When you are starving, your thoughts stop being human. You think only in shapes, the roundness of a loaf, the edge of a bowl, the steam of a pot. The frost gave them nothing. It preserved their bodies and their suffering." By mid-December, the wounded began to outnumber the living. The hospitals, if such a word still fit, were cellars black with mold and smoke. The air was thick with fever and decay. Candles burned down to stubs, shadows dancing over walls slick with frost. There were no more bandages, only scraps of uniforms. No more morphine, only teeth clenched in cloth. The surgeons' knives dulled, rusted, slipped from numb fingers. They worked by sound, now the crack of frozen flesh, the sigh that meant the end. The wounded begged not to be saved, but to be shot. Outside, the snow piled higher, white and pure over the stench below. The frost was cleaner than mercy. The radios whispered promises that no one believed. Berlin spoke of air supply. The Luftwaffe promised salvation 500 tons a day. The reality was 80, on the best days. And even those were lost to storms, to Soviet flak, to hunger on the ground. Supply planes came too high, too fast. The parachutes drifted down like ghosts, some carrying ammunition, some only empty boxes. The men ran toward the falling shapes, clawing through snow, praying for food. Sometimes it was shells. Sometimes it was cigarettes. Sometimes it was the body of another soldier frozen stiff in a supply harness. The sky, one survivor said, was always lying. The commanders kept their rituals. They wrote reports in perfect cursive using pencils that barely marked the page. They signed orders, hold positions. Prepare for counterattack. They sent requests to an empire that had already forgotten them. Paulus sat in his headquarters listening to the hum of a dying radio, his breath fogging the air. Around him, maps faded under frost, red lines blurred by moisture. His staff spoke in whispers. Some still saluted. Others stared at the floor, their faces hollow. "We are the last note of a song no one remembers," one aide murmured. The general said nothing. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks like laughter. Night after night, the frost deepened its rule. Temperatures dropped to 30, then 35 below. Steel shattered like glass. Men slept beside fires that burned out in minutes. They tried to huddle in groups, 3, 4, 5 together, trading warmth like currency. Some never woke. Their bodies froze where they lay, faces peaceful, hands still clasped around mess tins or photographs. In the morning, others brushed the snow from their comrades' eyes, took their gloves, and kept moving. The dead had become part of the landscape, fences of limbs, mounds of uniforms. They marked the edges of every trench, every path, every thought of home. When the Soviet loudspeakers began to call across the lines, some listened. "Lay down your arms," the voices said. "The frost will forgive you." But surrender was forbidden. The order was absolute: hold or die. They obeyed both. Some deserted into the night, vanishing into the blizzard. Others stayed polishing rifles that would never fire again, repeating to themselves that rescue was coming. The frost made liars of them all. Inside one shelter, a corporal named Kruger wrote his last entry: "No food for 3 days." The snow falls inside the room. The candle is gone. Hans is dead. I am too cold to think. If anyone finds this, tell my mother the stars are beautiful tonight. The paper froze to his hand before he finished. The Soviets could hear the dying through their scopes. They said it sounded like wind through reeds, soft, uneven, human. At dawn, they advanced through mist, past the frozen guns, past bodies seated upright in trenches. No resistance. No movement. Only the crackle of ice beneath their boots. They called out in Russian and got no answer. Some Germans raised hands too weak to wave. Others simply looked up, eyes glazed, white lips blue, as if surprised to see the living. The city was quiet now. Even artillery had gone still. Stalingrad no longer needed killing. The cold had done its work. The surrender came not with words, but with silence. Paulus sent a final message: "The troops have done their duty to the last man." No code, no defiance, just resignation. In the ruins, soldiers tore insignia from their sleeves, dropped rifles that cracked on impact. The Soviets led them away through snowdrifts higher than their knees. 91,000 marched from the ruins. Less than 5,000 would ever march again. After it was over, after the fires burned low and the frost settled back into quiet, the world took stock. It counted the dead 150,000. It counted the missing 70,000. It measured the distance from arrogance to ruin: 200 days, 40 below zero, and 1 unbroken winter. The figures were clean. The truth was not. Behind every number was a face, a breath, a sound cut short in the dark. The frost erased them slowly. Boots filled with snow helmets rusted into the ground. The Volga thawed and carried pieces downstream: letters, helmets, bones. Years later, farmers still found them staring up from the earth, their eyes long gone, their mouths frozen mid-sentence. The war, one Russian said, did not end here. It simply stopped making noise. History would write it as a turning point, the moment when the invincible became mortal, when victory shifted from west to east. But in truth, it was smaller than that. It was a room full of men who had stopped believing, a city that swallowed an army a winter, that decided it had waited long enough. They once believed the war would end before the snow, and so it did, only not the way they dreamed. As night fell over the steppe once more, the sky was clear, sharp, endless, cruel. Somewhere beneath it, an officer still sat in the ruins of his command post, his breath slow, his uniform stiff with frost. Around him, the wind moved papers that no longer mattered. He could still hear the last transmission echo in his head. "Hold the line." He laughed softly to no one. The frost touched his face like a hand, and when the morning came, he was still there. Another line erased from the ledger of the living, and the snow kept falling endlessly quietly, as if trying to bury the sound of their dreams. The snow fell like ash, endless, soft, cruel. You could no longer tell where the sky ended and the earth began. Both were white, both were dead. In a half-collapsed shelter, a young soldier named Emile sat by a cracked window, the glass frosted over in tiny veins like frozen blood vessels. He had been awake for 2 days. The candle beside him had burned down to a stub, its flame shaking in the wind that slipped through the walls. He held a small piece of paper in his hands, a letter he had started weeks ago, now folded and refolded until the corners had torn. The ink had faded, but the words were still there. "Dear Mother," they say, "the war will end before winter." He read it again, whispering the line under his breath. Then he smiled, not from joy but from memory. He looked around the room. 3 other soldiers were sleeping, or pretending to. One of them stirred, coughed, and didn't move again. Emile tucked the letter into his coat, touched the spot where his heart should have been warm, and whispered. His breath drifted out in a cloud of frost and vanished into the dark. The next night, inside what had once been a factory, a group of men huddled around a small fire made from broken furniture. The flames licked the air weakly, throwing orange light on faces hollow and gray. They had no food left, only pieces of paper, scraps of orders, maps of victories that never came. One soldier tore a page from a field manual and fed it to the fire. The man beside him laughed a dry, broken sound. "We're burning the future," he said. Another shook his head. "No," he answered. "We're just keeping warm long enough to watch it disappear." They sat in silence. In the corner, someone began to hum an old folk song, soft and trembling. The tune barely reached the air before it froze. When the fire went out, no one moved. The smoke drifted upward, painting black streaks on the ceiling. One man reached for the embers as if trying to steal back the heat. His hand froze there, the fingers still curved, eyes open to the light that wasn't there anymore. By morning, the city was quiet again. The wind had taken the last sounds away. Near the Volga, a chaplain walked through the snow, dragging a makeshift cross behind him. The air was so cold that his breath fell in crystals around his mouth. He was muttering prayers, though the words came out in pieces. Around him, the bodies lay in rows, frozen mid-gesture faces tilted toward the sky as if still expecting a signal. He stopped beside a young man clutching a Bible. The pages had fused together with ice. The chaplain opened it anyway, his hands trembling. He read aloud the first verse he saw, though he couldn't feel his lips forming the words. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." His voice cracked. He laughed quietly, almost kindly, and said to no one, "I suppose this is the valley then." He looked at the horizon, gray, endless, and kept walking. When he fell a few minutes later, the snow covered him gently, like a final benediction. Not far away, in a ruined apartment block, a captain sat on a pile of bricks. He had a child's doll in his hands, porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. It was the only thing left unburned in the house. He turned it over in his palms, brushing away the soot. The color of the dress reminded him of his daughter's coat. He could almost hear her laughter, high and bright like the sound of spring rivers. He had promised her he would bring home a medal. Instead, he brought silence. The captain reached into his pocket, took out his iron cross, and placed it in the doll's lap. "You keep it," he whispered. "I've got nothing left to pin it on." His voice broke on the last word. He leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. When the patrol found him later, the doll was still on his lap, the only bright thing in a world of gray. That evening, the wind began to change. The snow slowed. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath. Across the ruins, men looked up, not from hope, but from instinct. There was a sound in the distance, engines steady and low. Some thought it was rescue. Others knew better. The Soviets were coming. But there were no more bullets left, no more orders to follow. They stood in silence, hands trembling, watching shapes move through the mist. One German whispered, "Maybe it's spring." The officer beside him shook his head, smiling faintly. "No, just winter again." When the first Russian soldiers entered the square, they found no fight waiting, only figures sitting in the snow, heads bowed, rifles across their knees. Some had frozen that way days earlier. Others had simply stopped trying to wake up. And so it ended, not with a shout, but with a sigh. The city that was meant to fall had outlasted the men who came to conquer it. The war they thought would end before the frost had ended them instead. The snow covered everything, the letters, the fires, the dolls, the prayers. There were no flags now, no uniforms, only white, only quiet, only winter. And somewhere beneath it, that letter still waited, its words trapped forever between what was promised and what was lost. "Dear Mother, they say the war will end before winter." The letter was still in his hand when the snow began to fall again. A single page stiff with frost, half buried in the silence. "We'll be home before the winter," it said, ink cracked words frozen mid-promise. The wind turned it over once, twice, then carried it into the white void where everything else had vanished. Somewhere beneath that endless snow, the war was still breathing slow, shallow, like a dying man counting the seconds between heartbeats. They once believed winter was just another season, a line on the calendar to be crossed with courage. But here in Stalingrad, winter was not a season. It was a verdict. A God with no mercy, no voice, only cold. And every man who believed in warmth became its offering. The radio still crackled in the command post, though no one was alive to hear it. Static whispers, a voice repeating, "Hold the line. Reinforcements are near." Reinforcements were not near. They never were. The voice belonged to a man who had already died 2 days before. His words, like ghosts, kept circling the airwaves. Promises with no pulse. Above the snowfield plains that were supposed to deliver food and fuel dropped only shadows. One fell, flaming a streak of orange, vanishing into white. The men below didn't even turn to look. They'd seen too many skies on fire to still believe the heavens were on their side. In November time, stopped keeping count. Watches froze, ink froze, blood froze. One sergeant carved the date into the stock of his rifle, 22.1, and whispered, "We'll last till Christmas." He never made it to December. They found him sitting upright, eyes open, frost crawling over his lips like silver moss. He'd frozen mid-sentence, mid-faith. Around him the snow covered everything that still resembled hope. And yet they kept writing home. Because writing meant remembering there was still a home somewhere beyond the horizon. "Dear Mother, it's colder than I imagined, but the general says the war will end soon. Tell Father I'm fine." The paper shook in his hands, not from fear, from the cold. The ink bled into his fingers before it dried. When they found his letter weeks later, the words had turned blue, the color of dying veins. They had been told to hold the city, at all costs. but no one ever told them what all truly meant. The field kitchens froze, first spoons welded to pots, bread turned to stone. Then came the fuel, the oil, the medicine. Men tore pages from Bibles and burned them for a few seconds of light. Some burned photographs, the faces of wives and children turned to ash before their eyes. Still, they said to each other, "Before the snow ends, it'll be over." But snow doesn't end. It simply forgets to stop falling. In Berlin, maps were still being drawn with red pencils. The general's hands trembled not from cold, but from fear of reporting truth. Strategic withdrawal is temporary, they said. The Führer believes in victory, but victory was buried somewhere beneath 6 feet of ice and 200,000 bodies. Strategy is a luxury of the warm. In Stalingrad, warmth was an act of imagination. One man tried to build a fire out of helmets and rifle stocks. He sat before it, eyes wide, laughing quietly, as if it were the sun. Another still wore his medals over his coat, the metal frozen to his chest, branding him like guilt. Someone whispered that the cold was merciful, that it made dying gentle, like falling asleep. But those who froze didn't sleep. They stayed, eyes open, bodies stiff, forever witnessing the lie they had believed. The frost didn't just take lives, it took sound. Boots no longer crunched. Voices no longer echoed. Even the guns seemed to sigh before falling silent. The only noise left was the wind scraping against tin helmets and frozen cloth. A whisper that said nothing, yet meant everything. It was Winter speaking, and Winter had nothing kind to say. A messenger stumbled into command with the final coded transmission. His face was black with frostbite, his eyes clouded. He handed the paper over: air support inbound tomorrow. Then he collapsed. The officer didn't even unfold the page. He already knew tomorrow was a word that no longer existed. Still, the transmission was logged. Still, the order was filed. Still, the war machine kept writing even when no one was left to read. When the surrender came, it didn't sound like defeat. It sounded like relief. A pen scratching on thin paper. A hand trembling. The officer who signed it whispered, "God forgive us." No one answered. Outside, the snow kept falling as if heaven had turned its face away. The sound of that pen became the last gunshot of Stalingrad. Of the 250,000 men who entered the cauldron, only 91,000 surrendered. Of those, fewer than 5,000 ever returned home. Each number a tomb without a name. Each survivor a ghost carrying the weight of the frost inside his bones. They said time would heal. But time only froze the memory deeper. In Moscow, they celebrated. In Berlin, they denied. In the ruins, there was no one left to do either. Only the wind, loyal to no side, weaving through helmets, whispering the names no one would remember. The city itself seemed to exhale a sigh made of smoke and snow. It was over. But for those who believed, it was only beginning. They had marched east under banners of pride, certain the world would yield before their engines, their steel, their faith. But no weapon could pierce cold air. No bullet could shatter silence. No doctrine could outlive hunger. And in the end, they discovered something older than war, something greater than empire, something that did not care who fired first. Winter. Some said they saw figures still standing in the fields long after February soldiers who'd frozen upright rifles clutched to their chests, faces pale like statues. The locals called them the Sentinels of Snow. At night, when the wind howled across the Volga, they swore they could hear the sound of boots marching not forward, not back, just lost. One Russian nurse who walked those fields years later wrote in her diary, "They were enemies, but they looked the same in death." The snow made them equal. Her words survived. Their bodies did not. That was the true symmetry of war. Everyone looked like brothers when covered in white. And so the belief that the war would end before winter became a curse whispered to every generation after. Soldiers in new uniforms, in new wars, still repeated it. We'll be home by Christmas. But history remembers. History waits in the frost. Because every time someone says it, winter smiles. Somewhere on the frozen banks of the Volga, beneath layers of ice and silence, the ink of that first letter still bleeds. We'll be home before the winter. The paper is gone. The man is gone. But the lie remains. It drifts through time like a snowflake that never melts, delicate, doomed, eternal. The camera rises. The horizon disappears into a sheet of white. 1,000 graves without markers. 1,000 dreams buried under the same sky. The wind carries the echo, faint, fading, infinite. They once believed the war would end before winter, but winter became their grave. Then silence. Only silence. And that silence is the sound of faith frozen forever. The war had ended, or so they said. But the cold did not leave when the soldiers did. It stayed stitched into the bricks, the breath, the bones of every survivor. The streets were quiet now, not peaceful, just emptied. The smell of iron still floated in the wind. Dogs wandered through what used to be homes. They carried bits of uniforms in their mouths. And when the sun rose, it rose like something ashamed, too pale, too thin, as if it had seen too much. People didn't cheer. They just stood still, waiting for the air to remember warmth again. The first thaw came late that year. The Volga cracked open with a sound that echoed like distant artillery. Water crawled over the ice, slow and reluctant. The men who had survived the siege returned to the riverbank, not to wash, not to drink, just to watch. They stood there in silence, boots sinking into the mud, until one of them began to cry without sound. He bent down and scooped a handful of water, stared at it trembling in his hand, and whispered, "It's moving again." Then he let it fall, and the droplets hit the ground like blood returning to a body. Far away in villages untouched by the front, mothers began to count the years since their sons had left. They had run out of tears long before. Now they wept with silence, a silence so thick it filled the house. They sat beside photographs that had started to fade, faces dissolving like frost on glass. Every winter they placed a candle by the window. "He'll come back before the snow," they'd whisper. But each candle burned shorter, and each winter felt longer. Hope became a habit, and habits survive even when faith dies. One mother walked for weeks to reach the city, clutching a small wooden cross tied with ribbon. The guards tried to turn her away, but she kept walking. She crossed fields where the snow hid everything but the crows. When she reached the ruins, she didn't ask for directions. She just knelt and pressed her hand to the ground. "You're home," she said softly. The wind blew her scarf loose, wrapped it around her face like a veil. When they found her the next day, she was still kneeling covered in snow, her fingers frozen to the soil. The reconstruction began before the ground thawed. Men with hammers and women with bare hands cleared the rubble. They built fast, too fast, as if they feared looking down. Beneath every foundation lay something that used to breathe. They said nothing about it. Cement covered everything, the memories, the guilt, the bones. At night, when the wind came off the river, it carried the smell of dust and iron and something older, something human. "Keep building," the foreman said. And so they did. They built cities over graves and called it victory. Years passed. The men who survived learned to speak again carefully, like people afraid their words might break the air. Some never spoke at all. One of them, a teacher before the war, spent the rest of his life writing the same sentence on a blackboard. "The war will end before winter." When the students asked why he smiled but didn't answer, they thought it was a lesson about hope. It wasn't. It was the only lie he had ever believed. In the summer of 1948, the first post-war festival was held. Music filled the streets again, violins, trumpets, laughter, brittle and forced. Children chased kites through the air where planes once fell. For a moment, people believed in joy again. But when a gust of wind blew cold across the square, everyone stopped. The musicians lowered their bows. For a few seconds, it felt as if winter had stepped into the crowd unseen but undeniable. And then, like actors remembering their lines, they began to play again. Somewhere along the Volga, a fisherman caught a button tangled in his net. It was still attached to a piece of cloth gray, frayed with a trace of blue stitching. He held it for a long while, turning it in the light. Then he dropped it back into the water. "The river keeps what it wants," he said. "We just borrow the surface." That night, as the sun set over the thawing ice, the water shimmered red, not from blood, but from memory, refusing to fade. In the archives, clerks typed reports with clean hands. Numbers replaced names. Casualties 200,000, prisoners 91,000, returnees 5,000. Their typewriters clicked like gunfire, neat, precise, merciless. Ink replaced blood. Statistics replaced grief. The war became data-tidy, measurable, finished. But in the quiet hours when the lamps flickered and the pages rustled, some swore they heard whispering between the lines like the sound of breath trapped in paper. By the 1950s, the world had moved on. New wars began. New generals promised new victories before winter. The veterans listened to the radios in silence. They knew how it ended. They had lived it. When the snow started to fall, some of them would go outside and stand in it, hatless, coat open, just to remember what it felt like to lose everything and still be breathing. One of them said, "It's the only time I feel close to them again." Then he looked at the sky and smiled through his tears. In the city, there was a boy who found an old letter beneath a floorboard. The ink had run the words, faded, but one line was still legible. "We'll be home before winter." He didn't understand what it meant. He showed it to his grandfather, who stared at it for a long time, his lips trembling. "Keep it," the old man said. "It belongs to you now." The boy asked why. The old man didn't answer. He just looked out the window at the falling snow and whispered, "Because it never ended." Winter came again, as it always does. The snow covered the fields where factories once stood, where soldiers once fell, where mothers once wept. The wind softened. The world looked clean, innocent, as if the frost had forgiven everything. But forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Beneath that white stillness lay the same bones, the same faith that had frozen years ago. The snow was not mercy. It was memory wearing a disguise. In 1963, a filmmaker visited the ruins to shoot a documentary. He carried a camera that clicked like a heartbeat. When he played back the film that night, he saw shapes moving through the fog, silhouettes where no one had stood. Faces in windows long collapsed. The reels burned slightly as they spun like the film itself was shivering. "They never left," he wrote in his notes. "They just changed form from soldiers into shadows." And now, decades later, the wind still sounds the same. It passes over rebuilt walls, through modern streets, and down into the frozen ground. Every flake that falls carries a trace of something ancient, the breath of a man who once believed he'd be home before the snow. The war has no echo now, only a pulse buried under ice. But sometimes when the thaw begins, the air warms just enough to release it, a whisper faint but clear. "We thought it would end before winter. We were wrong." Then the sound fades, and the snow begins again. Slow, endless, eternal. When the last frame fades, the white sky swallows everything. The world stops breathing. Snow keeps falling soft and endless, as if time itself forgot how to move. There are no voices now, only wind sliding through the hollow bones of what used to be cities. If you stand still long enough, you can almost hear them, a million heartbeats that ended in silence, a million words that froze before being spoken. The air carries them still. It carries the ache of 1,000 promises, each one whispered before winter came. The old soldier sits by the window. The fire has gone out, but he doesn't notice. He watches the snow drift past the glass and sees faces in every flake. He lifts his hand trembling, catches one on his skin. It melts instantly, leaving a wet mark like a tear. He smiles, tired, almost tender. They all melt, he says softly, every one of them. The photograph on the wall watches him back, his own face once young, believing unbroken. He turns away. He cannot bear to meet the eyes of a man who still had hope. The wind crosses the river. The reeds whisper. Some nights their dry stalks rub together and sound like voices calling through sleep. Travelers stop to listen. It's just the air, someone says. But the others know better. They bow their heads when the whisper passes. We thought we'd be home before winter. Then nothing. Only the sound of water underneath the ice, slow and patient, like time waiting to begin again. In a new city built over the ruins, children laugh as they build snowmen. Their mittens are red, their cheeks pink, their breath white. They don't know that under their boots lies a layer of earth that once trembled with artillery. They don't know that the snow they pack into smiling faces is made of the same dust that once buried the dead. But perhaps it's better this way. Perhaps innocence is what the fallen bought for them, one quiet winter at a time. Somewhere in that city, a mother lights a candle in the window. The flame flickers in the reflection of the snow. She whispers a name that no one else remembers. It drifts into the cold, joins 1,000 other names carried by the night. Outside, the snow thickens. It falls without sound, without mercy, without end. And the world looks peaceful again, terribly, heartbreakingly peaceful. The camera rises past the rooftops, the river, the endless white plain. The world below is small, still asleep. Above, the sky glows pale blue, untouched. The snow keeps falling upward now toward the light. And then a voice returns, low, calm, almost kind. They once believed the war would end before winter. But winter became their grave. And even now, even here, the snow still remembers. The wind takes the words, the screen turns to black, then one heartbeat, and silence, cold, eternal, and beautiful.